The time is now 1:50. I'm calling into order the Pilot Revenue Committee. Today is Monday, February 10th at 1:50. Present, we have Councilor Katie Walsh. Councilor Walsh, thank you for joining us. Councilor Govan sent her regrets. She's unable to join us today. She's traveling for other purposes. We all don't see Councilor Lover Clerk as of yet. We have remotely committee members, Mr. Latorre, Juan Latorre. Juan, thank you for being here. We also have committee member Karen Lee. Karen, thank you like always. You are such a superstar, Karen. We have also remotely Kathy Bono. Kathy, hello. Lindsay Hackett. Councilor Maria Perez just joined us. Councilor Perez, thank you for joining us, man. We also have in chambers, we have the solicitor, the legend, Steve Bonaconte. How you doing, solicitor? Very well. And so also,
if I may, Mr. Chairman, we're also joined by Mr. Lonigan, former treasurer.
okay. Oh, Steve's there.
Great City.
Good, Steve, I can't see you, but I'm glad that you're here, buddy. Very well.
Right.
We also joined by remotely by former treasurer Richard Allen. Richard, thank you for joining us. Oh, you're muted, buddy. Okay, so we have Richard Allen, and today we have a presentation by the Collins Center. We are being joined by Sarah Concannon. Sarah, thank you for joining us. And I believe we also have Mr. Gail Cirillo, also from the Collins Center. Is that correct?
Stephen, but yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry?
Stephen Cirillo.
Stephen, nice to meet you, Stephen. Thank you for joining us. So why don't we get started? The purpose of today's meeting is to have a presentation by the Collins Center. The Collins Center is a very well-known institution here in Massachusetts that works with, correct me if I'm mistaken, ladies and gentlemen, from the Collins Center with nonprofits and mainly municipal institutions to help them draft policies and how to sort of guide the boat into the right direction, correct? To say layman's terms. So why don't turn it over, I believe, Sarah, are you giving the main presentation today?
I am happy to start and speak. We don't have a presentation as it were, but we're here to talk about the Collins Center and talk about the work that the finance team does and the work that we are have been doing and can do vis-a-vis pilot programs. And we're happy to, answer any questions you all might have. And if there's something more that you need from us, we can certainly prepare that.
Sure, Sarah, so why don't you start with that and then we'll take it from there. Sarah,
all right, thank you, Councilor. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you today. I have had a conversation with Mr. Latorre about the goings-on in Springfield. I know you guys are looking into whether a payment in lieu of taxes program might be a useful thing for the city. I'm going to introduce the Collins Center first, and apologies if you are very familiar with the Collins Center. I think it's helpful to have a baseline because there may be some folks who have only heard about, heard our name or may just not be familiar with the scope of services that we can provide. And then I'll introduce my colleague and turn it over to him to talk a little bit about some of the specific work that we've done around pilots. So the Collins Center was created by the state legislature back in 2008. And we were created essentially to provide low-cost, practical, technical assistance and consulting services to public sector entities in the Commonwealth. The vast majority of the work that we do is with cities and towns, as the counselor noted, although we do work with state agencies, quasi-governmental entities, and occasionally nonprofits, although that's very somewhat more of a rare circumstance. The Collins Center has grown over the years to provide a really broad scope of services to cities and towns. Of course, we do things that are sort of the bread and butter of cities and towns, finance, HR, but we also have practice areas that cover IT, charter and organizational structure, communications, regionalization, health and human services, really anything that the city is required to do or does provide, in terms of services to its residents and businesses and visitors, we can provide support. The one area that we tend not to provide deep services is in the area of planning and development, mostly because our friends at the regional planning agencies are here as a resource for cities and towns. Occasionally, we do partner with the RPAs, though, to provide support to cities and towns. So the finance team at the Collins Center has been one of the teams that we stood up very early in our existence. So we've had our finance team since the founding of the center back in 2008, 2009. And we provide all manner of support when it comes to city and town finances. We do things like help with budgeting, develop capital plans, help write or review financial policies, develop financial forecasts, etc. We also do a lot of custom work, whether that means coming in and helping a town look at its organizational structure vis-a-vis its finance officers, or whether it's helping a community facing a potential override look at its forecast and really develop some strategies for revenue enhancement or expense control that are going to be part of its potential override strategy. Pilots are one of the areas that I would say is sort of an ad hoc service that we can provide. So we do not come in and say, hey, we have this standard package of services that we're going to give you around a potential pilot program, because a lot of communities are in different, sort of all over the map when it comes to pilots. Some are just starting this journey. Some have a number of ad hoc or informal agreements that have existed for a long time. Others have a really more robust strategy, but need help with thinking through negotiations and some of those things. So we are here to help. Our teams are really practitioner based. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Steve in a minute, but most of the folks that we have on staff have sat in the seats of municipal officials, whether they are former finance directors or accountants or police chiefs or assessors. We really bring, I would say, a pragmatic and realistic approach to getting things done in cities and towns. And that really builds on the fact that we've been there and we know that it can be a challenge, and sometimes things don't go in a linear, path. So let me hand it over to
When they wish.
Yeah. Let me hand it over to my colleague Steve to introduce himself and talk a little bit about the work that he's done at the Collins Center, and maybe a little bit more about pilot and the work we can do to support pilots.
Well, thank you,
Sure,
Sarah.
Steve, floor is yours.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today. I thought first I would give you a brief summary of my working experience, and also, as a side to that, my experience with pilots. I started my career working for the city of New York in the budget office, and then came to the town of Brookline as a budget analyst before going to the city of Newton as a budget director. I then went on to become the treasurer collector of Newton before going back to Brookline, first as the deputy town administrator and then the finance director. I retired from the finance office in 2016. I give that as an intro to piece together what I did with pilots at the time. my first experience with pilots was back in about 1988, where I negotiated an agreement with Boston College and the city of Newton for a mixed agreement, cash and in-kind services. In my view, that wasn't a great agreement. You learn from your experiences. The Department of Revenue then asked me to put together a training manual to train cities and towns on how to negotiate pilots. That was back in the late 80s, early 90s. I then went to the back to the town of Brookline. And as you know, you probably hear this, cities and towns are just about ready to go for an override, and they think that they need to show the citizens that they're moving every rock to see if they can make savings before they go into the override, maybe to reduce the amount of the override or even to eliminate it altogether. And Brookline did that. They created a committee back in 2008, sort of like an efficiency committee. And one of the things that was recommended from that study was that the town should pursue pilot agreements. And so as the finance director, they handed that over to me. And I was in charge of that program from basically 2009 through my retirement in 2016. During that time, I successfully negotiated 22 pilot agreements. Some of them, what I call low-hanging fruit, and others pretty difficult agreements. Included in the difficult ones was Boston University, Children's Hospital, Beaver Country Day School, a number of religious institutions, a number of other institutions, smaller institutions as well. So 22. You learn how to put together a pilot by doing pilots and probably even making mistakes in doing pilots. One of the things that I've learned is, well, I'm a history buff as far as pilots are concerned, so I check in on what other communities are doing. And one of the things that I've noted is that communities enter pilot agreements with a handshake, which is probably a bad form. City of Boston is a perfect example that the City of Boston has done a great job in pilots, but many of their pilots are not memorialized in writing. And as a result of this, every year you hear the City of Boston in a news story saying, well, they expected this in pilots, but they didn't get it because the tax-exempt parcels didn't pay. You avoid that issue when you have a contract in place. Now, a pilot is a voluntary agreement, but once they volunteer to do it, when you memorialize it in a written agreement, then it becomes you're in the realm of contract law. And as a result of that, you have more different paths to collect. That's the best way to say it. The other thing I noted, and I continue to watch across the state when communities are doing pilots, is what is the pilot based upon? As Sarah has said, it's all over the place. Amherst College just announced, you probably read it, that they're going to give the town $2.5 million for a pilot agreement over 3 years. And when you look at that on its face, you say, wow, this is really great. But it's not really great. That money could be spent one time on capital, buy a fire truck, do some building repairs and things of that. But at the end of 3 years, that money goes away. What communities need is to be able to project and predict what their available revenue is from year to year and have that revenue grow. And so there should be a methodology for that. And I want to give credit, the methodology on this is to the City of Boston. Back in the early 90s, they came up with a formula which I was extremely impressed with, that said basically that nonprofit tax exempt parcels are within your community. They do not use all the services. They don't use public schools. They don't use libraries. They don't use a lot of stuff, but they do use the police department 24/7, the fire department 24/7, public works, street maintenance, and snow removal. And those three departments fully with full benefits. And Boston did an analysis on that and proved that the cost of those services represented about 25% of their levy. So when I read that in the early 90s, I started trying to emulate that. And in fact, I proved that in the town of Brookline, that was basically 25%. So there you go. There's a standard out there now for what is your target for your pilot. Because they're all over the map, as I say. Some people just do a flat amount for just a very limited term. But what you really should be doing is having a consistent revenue flow. And so the methodology was to base it on values rather than plucking a number out of the air. Now,
Steve, if I may just, I'm kind of curious if I could interrupt you for a second. Is this formula that you're talking about, would you happen to know if it's adjusted for inflation? Or it
yeah.
could be?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Councilman, because in fact, that's the beauty of this methodology. That I'll also point out, Boston and Brookline are now both doing it. I believe Northampton is doing it and Milton is doing it as well. And other communities that we've been talking to are considering. And what that is that based on value, all value comes from the assessors of each community. But it's based on value. The one thing we know about land value or building value, it's going up. And so you have a target of X dollars, X percent of what they would have paid if they pay taxes. But since the values of the land and the building are growing from year to year, the target amount of 25% grows with inflation, which means that it's always current. Again, some of the flaws of cities and towns is they don't have it in, even if they have it in writing, they pick a number out and the tax exempt parcel is paying that, but years go by and they're still paying the same thing.
Right.
That is as helpful it is to get funds into the till for any community. The revenue has to grow with inflation, or we all know the math of Proposition 2.5. Unless your other revenues grow, it puts tremendous pressure on your property tax levy, your residential property tax levy.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the types of things that Collins Center proposes and recommends to communities, that it be based, there should be a written contract. It should be based on values. And the final thing is, this is more sensitive, I think, is that each community has to treat all tax exempt parcels the same. As an example, I'll take you back to the town of Brookline. Boston University and Children's Hospital were willing to do a pilot with us, but they were not willing to even have a conversation with us unless we treated all of the tax exempts in the community the same, which meant that we could not publicly announce, well, we're not going to talk to this group of tax exempts. We're not going to talk to religious institutions. We're not going to talk to the boys club or the girls club or things like that. You have to have a methodology that says, this is what we're going to do. Now, negotiations are negotiations. You could either commence negotiations with all nonprofits, or you don't have to. You can do it over a period of time. You get to the big ones first, or the ones your target tax exempt parcels first, and maybe get to these more sensitive ones later. But on paper, it's important to show the fact that you're being neutral in this and everybody's being treated the same. And when I just said on paper, that's another thing. A community should have a pilot policy that stands out and says, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. That's what we do in the Collins Center.
Thank you, Steve. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I will say that first, thank you for that wonderful introduction to both Sarah and Steve. And the purpose of this committee is to identify new revenue to the city. As we've been told before, we expect some difficult times in the future, the whole nation, no, of course, but here in Springfield, this is our duty, Springfield. And we're trying to be as creative as possible. I know what my vision is, and I have this wonderful team here that are helping us create and draft this clay into something that is done properly and that is going to be that will be lasting and that will meet our needs. As I've always said, and I think it's important to reemphasize in this meeting, that I see the nonprofits as our allies, as our partners in this. Because in order to have a great city, we need the help. Because we are a financially strapped city. And they provide a lot of services, a lot of good, but we need the help and we need them to step up to the plate even more because we're all, for lack of better words, in the same boat. With that being said, Steve, I have some quick questions for you. You say you negotiated a total of 22 pilots throughout your career, which is pretty impressive. Can you tell me?
22 in Brookline and 1 in Newton, so 23.
Oh, 22 in Brookline, very well, so 23 total. You mentioned the one in Cambridge, which caught my eye. Can you tell me, at least for that one, if you could, what was, tell me one thing that was good about the contract and one thing that you think could have been better.
For Cambridge?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, before we launched into our pilot program in Brookline, we went to the city of Cambridge to talk to the city about their program. We brought the city of Boston over to Brookline. Their chief assessor, Ron Rockow, came over to Brookline to talk about Boston's program. So we wanted to educate ourselves on how other communities were doing it. What we found in Cambridge, and this could only be happening in Cambridge, Cambridge is really large and they have a lot of nonprofits, tax exempts. They negotiated an agreement with Harvard and MIT, reached the agreement, I believe it's in writing, everything's good. They had no fundamental policy behind it. It was, please, this lump sum every year, okay? But then they said, well, we don't care about the rest of the tax exempt, so they just sent out a bill to literally every tax exempt in the city, and none of them paid. But they because they already had Harvard and MIT, they were getting substantial $10 to $20 million a year in pilot payments, so they didn't particularly care about the smaller ones. We thought that was not something we would want to do. We wanted to have a policy in which, again, we treated everybody the same. Brookline's had large pilots and they had tiny pilots. So that's what I would say about Cambridge. They have success. They have success generating money, but it's not based on a policy or things like that.
Okay, very well. And quick question, Steve, Bonaconte solicitor. Is there anything you think you should comment or any thoughts regarding the aspect of a contract? If you don't feel a need, that's okay.
Not about the contract. I've been following the presentation. I guess my question to Mr. Cirillo is, how do you bring the nonprofits to the table? Because what we're dealing with,
great question.
The terrain that we're facing in the city of Springfield is we have major health institutions. We have a number of higher ed institutions in the region. who all are telling the city the same thing, which is they're on hard economic times, you know, all the challenges in the healthcare world. They're saying that they don't have any money. Higher ed is saying that they're struggling as well with enrollment and the like. How do you bring them to the table when in fact this has to be a voluntary agreement by the nonprofit to enter with the municipality?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and one that I believe I have an answer to. First of all, again, we start with the comment about all the community should treat all tax exempt parcels the same. But in addition to that, and also building on what Boston did with setting the 25% mark for the pilot, it would be 25% of what they would have paid if they paid taxes. That's still a large number for these tax exempt, so that's hard to get them to the table. One of the things that I added to the discussions on pilot, particularly successful in Brookline, was that I offered them a phase up to the 25%. So thinking that, I'll give you an example, Beaver Country Day School. They agreed to the 25%, but we negotiated and agreed that they would phase it up over a period of time. So the phase up is negotiable, but in Beaver Country Day's case, they started at 1%, and the next year was 2%, and the next year was 3%. Once you get them to agree to yes, and in a written contract, the 1% is so small that it's difficult for them to say no to 1%.
Mm.
If you said, look, we want 25%, you're going to turn off the conversation with a lot of these tax exempts, because they are, in fact, in the same economic stress that the cities and towns are, but at a lower percent. And again, that percentage phase up is negotiated. I mean, I give you an example. I had.
You didn't mention a street. That was somebody that wanted to.
I'm sorry, I have a background noise. Can
Oh, okay.
everybody mute?
Yeah, I thought someone was asking me a question.
No, I think.
Yeah, in
Go ahead,
Brookline,
Steve.
in
Go ahead.
Brookline, I had some groups that went right to 25%. I had another couple of nonprofits that started off at 1% and phased up to 25. I had a couple that started off at 5%, then 10, 15, 20, 25,
Good.
all heading to 25. So that's the way that I would answer the question about how do you get them to the table. The other approach, and this again came out of Boston in the early 90s, was that when you look at your complete portfolio of tax exempt parcels, you have large ones and you have these little tiny community ones. And so you have to thread the needle carefully here, because you want to treat everybody the same, all tax exempts the same. But as long as it's based on value, Boston came up with this idea that said that tax exempt parcels under a certain dollar of value would have a different target. They came up with a 15% target rather than a 25%. So the big colleges and universities and hospitals and everything are paying the 25%, and then the smaller ones are paying no more than 15%. And again, you could do a phase up of that. So when you have these tiny ones that phases up from 1 to 15% over 15 years, if you want to, again, that's negotiable between the tax exempt and the community. So
Thank
that's
you.
how I would
Thank
do
you,
it.
Steve.
Can I ask can I
Follow-up
ask
question?
a
Go ahead, Steve.
Any of the agreements with the Diocese of Boston?
No, but there were 5 religious institutions we had in Brookline that had pilots. I couldn't crack the Diocese of Boston, although I tried.
Yeah, we're gonna have a hard time cracking the Diocese of Springfield.
Yeah, they're pretty strong. Yeah, they're pretty, they know the biggest word in the English language is no.
What about the charter schools? Have you had
Uh,
any luck with that?
Yeah, Karen, just give me a second, please, if you could. Thank you. Steve, is that all your questions?
That's it for now, Counselor. I don't want to take.
Thank you. Karen, I'm gonna get to you in a second. The Councilor Walsh or Paris, any questions?
No, but this is fascinating that there are places that pilots do work.
Mhm.
Oh, they,
23 of them throughout the state.
no, it's, pilots are working across the Commonwealth.
Yeah,
They're just not being consistent with their methodology.
right. Very well. Sarah, did you have a comment? A response?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just add, if I could, building on what Steve talked about, I think that what we've seen and from our experience, the two key pieces are having a policy that has been vetted, is out there publicly, so that everybody in the community, residents, businesses, tax exempt parcel owners, know that this is the policy of the city. That's one important step in bringing people to the table. The second step is momentum. And Steve talked about momentum in the sense of that phase up period that often can be used as a negotiating tactic. The other part of the momentum piece is prioritizing that list. You may have hundreds of parcels on the list, the broader list, and you need to narrow down and figure out where are we going to start, because you're not going to go and try to negotiate with every single tax exempt property owner, and you want to build momentum. You want to get to yes for some of the big ones, or some of those that are wanting to really demonstrate publicly their commitment to the city. And so you're going to want to start with some that you think you can get some success from the conversations. One example that Steve has given in the past is, maybe there is a small school or a school that doesn't have its own play space and uses a city play space very regularly for its students. That's an opportunity for the city to prioritize potentially that parcel owner and say, hey, it's pretty clear that you're using city services. Let's talk about whether we can come
Right.
to. So using momentum, I think, as the sort of guiding light is a key part of the negotiation success process.
Yeah, I'd add to
Thank you.
that, been saying
Thank you,
momentum
Sarah.
and leverage. The park use is a perfect example of that.
Thank you, sir.
There are other parcels that they have, how can I say, they there's a parcel, a tax exempt parcel out there, but they use a piece of that. They rent it out to somebody as a commercial part of the building is commercial rather than tax exempt. Well, that means that portion is taxable. And that happens with a lot of, unfortunately, it happens with a lot of religious institutions. They try to make some money for the parish, and so they rent out a piece of the rectory, or they rent a space in their parking lot for overnight parking or something, and that makes all of that taxable. But you can, in fact, as a community, say, well, why don't you just pay a pilot rather than paying the tax? You'd probably pay less. And those small ones say yes to that very, very quickly, because they would be cheaper for them to do it, less expensive tax-wise, to do a pilot rather than tax.
Thank you, Steve. Karen?
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on what the solicitor had asked. And in this case, it's charter schools. And, not all charter schools in the city, but there's a few of them that are listed as a real estate company. And so I'm just wondering if you've had any luck with charter schools. You did mention if they're using a playscape that belongs to the city, but have you had any interaction with that type of institution?
Karen, that's a good question. I have to admit that there weren't any charter schools in Brookline, so I did not have that experience. But I will say that regardless of the use, of the property, the tax income property. Again, they should be treated the same. So in my mind's eye, there's there's a charter school. It could be a charter school, but it could be a private school as well. And you wouldn't want to treat the private school one way and the charter school another way. You have to come up with a policy. This is the policy that the community should approve and adopt before you even start the program. That basically finds the sweet spot of how you're going to treat all the communities, tax exempts the same.
So to address that, you're probably aware of the Pilot Action Committee, mostly centered in the eastern part of the state, but I'm part of that coalition. There's a couple of us here in Western Mass. And it's working on the legislative level to get the pilot bill passed, right? So in that bill, it's 25%. And so my question is, if we start playing around and saying, okay, 15, and that's over $15 million of property, which means it excludes all of those smaller nonprofits that we're talking about. So trying to like square that knot. So what happens if the bill passes, then they don't have to pay anything? Or do we want to continue collecting from very small groups? So I just wanted to throw that out there because
I think if the legislation ever gets passed, and by the
Right.
way, it's been
20 years.
legislation for at least 20 years, at least 20 years. I think it was there in the 90s. But if they were to say it passed, it would be something like a community may charge as much as 25%.
Right.
And that would be the loophole for a community to do less. I think that's how it'll end up. But at this
But
point in
15
time, I haven't seen
million,
really motion to get that passed. I mean,
but it's the 15 million of property that would be taxed. Anything less than that would not be assessed.
is that what the legislation said?
Yes, that's what the legislation says. On the
I don't like that.
Well, I think that is because there's so many small organizations out there that do good works that
No, I agree. But that's that break point about the 15 versus the 25, getting to the same point. But if the bill says anything over X can have a pilot, and anything under $15 million would not have a pilot. We're working right now in the city of Holyoke. We're almost done there. And I look at the 800 or 900 parcels of tax exempt parcels in that community. And if the legislation passed, there would be no pilots.
so very good point.
No one's going to hit that $15 million mark in Holyoke. So you can't have a number like that because all communities are different. The property values in each community are different.
Right. I think that it, it was Boston centric. And so they were looking at the eds and the meds, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's way over 15 million there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good point that if we go ahead and we start these pilot programs and we start assessing the smaller industry organizations, and then this law passes, and then oops, we can't charge them anymore. So that's a good point to keep in mind.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No problem, Karen. Great questions, Karen. Richard, Mr. Allen, do you have a question, sir?
So yes, thank you, Counselor. I wanted to respond to the comment about charter schools. When I was at the assessor's office, we had an agreement with the Sabas Charter School out in 16 acres with the original Sabas board and organization. And we're now at least two organizations removed from that. But the original Sabas, we had a pilot agreement with them. It was for cash. It wasn't a significant amount, But when that Minnesota-based organization, which had a local board, when the local board created their own organization, and which is now known as Springfield International Charter School, that local organization felt that they weren't obligated to enter into a pilot agreement or continue the prior one. So that ceased probably 10 years ago, that payment stream. And I don't know if it's now constituted as the Springfield International Charter School. I don't know if there's anything that's been entered into with them, but that was the only charter school that I recall having a cash agreement. There's several other charter schools, a couple of which failed, but and then there are several others that have begun in recent years and have moved to significant pieces of real estate in the industrial park. There's at least two, I think 3 instances of that happening, taking over commercial real estate and as owners. And I don't believe that any of them have pilot agreements. But I also want to ask Steve Cirillo, with regard to Boston, my recollection is that there were a couple of ways of achieving the 25% standard, or even the 15% in the case of institutions with less value. And that was there was cash, but then there was also the community benefits factor. And, I think that might have been, I went to a seminar or two with Ron Rockow, and it seems to me that the community benefits might have been related to the AG's office and the public charity filings that occur annually, and how that was determined. But I haven't looked at this in years, so maybe you could comment on that, Steve.
Yeah, well, first of all, I apologize for being a person of very strong opinions. And I also look at the work I've done, and my worst critic, the Boston College pilot that I negotiated back in late 80s in Newton was a perfect example of that. Total failure. So it worked, but I was very disappointed in my own performance in that. We had a split agreement in which they were going to pay us $100,000 a year in cash, and that would increase by 2.5% a year. And then they would pay the other 75% or other dollar amount equal to about $350,000 a year in-kind service, which is the same as the community benefit program in Boston. It's hard to measure it, and you find that there's a lot of obstacles to in-kind service. Boston College agreed to cut the green space on the Comm Ave. There's a center space with trees and grass. The union of the city of Newton decided that they didn't want them there because they were going to lose jobs. And so that fell apart. And we didn't have a written agreement on that. Now, my opinion is that the purpose for a pilot agreement is to generate revenue, ongoing and consistent revenue for the community for now into the future. And in-kind service doesn't do anything to solve your budget problems. All it does is support something that was already outside of the operating budget in the first place. It doesn't help you avoid an override.
Steve, just a quick question on those in-kind. No, so I find it interesting that you say that it doesn't do anything to solve the problem, but also, and correct me if I'm mistaken, the actual value amount tends to be lower than what the community really needs, correct?
I'm not sure I understand your question, sir.
If they do some sort of in-kind service, if you were to put a value amount to that in-kind
Oh,
service.
okay, yeah. Well, what typically is the case is that they define what the 25% would have been dollar wise, and then say, this is going to be in cash and this is going to be in kind service. And then they figure out what the cost of those services are. But again, if those services are not currently in the operating budget, being supported in the operating budget, then it doesn't do anything to help the financially balance your budget in future years.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Oh, very well. Karen?
Yes, Richard, I'm gonna pick your institutional knowledge brain because, and this is also for the solicitor. We have 15 pilot agreements in Springfield. Most of them are all with an agency. And so, Steve,
Association.
excuse me?
The Mental Health Association has
Yeah,
several.
yes. And so the question I had for the solicitor was, look at these pilot agreements, and is there something in them that we can extend it now to other housing agencies who receive Section 8 funding or federal funding? And so I don't know where he is with that answer, but could you tell me why were those particular mental health pilot agreements made? Like, why them? Not anyone else, any other kind of housing, but why those particular ones? Do you happen to have knowledge of that?
Well, you're trying to reach into the recesses of about 40 years of memory here. So, the Mental Health Association of Greater Springfield has been, they come to mind immediately, because every time they would acquire a property and they were going to HUD for, for funding for the residents of that property to be subsidized, they would then come to the assessors and, negotiate an agreement based on a formula. And I'm trying to remember if that started before I was there. I arrived at the assessor's office in October of '86.
The first one was 1998, I think, the first one, like in the early 90s, and the last one was 2018, I think.
Yeah. Or there might have been somewhere they've sold the property since. I don't know. We may have initiated it. I don't recall exactly. I mean, the late '80s, early '90s, we were in severe fiscal distress. And it wasn't the only time the city's been in that circumstance, but so we may have initiated it at the time when we saw a sale occur. And they had a great attitude. They were willing to engage in those discussions and do their share for the city budget with cash.
So Richard, they're still paying. It's a contract without an end date, but specifically, those are the only ones with the pilot agreements. There are two others non-related, but there are all kinds of housing agencies that use Section 8. And so is there some legal reason? Was there some particular housing reason? Like,
there
why?
might have been something in the HUD regulations at the time for the particular funding source they were using, that you've got to show that you're involved with the community. I don't remember exactly. There aren't a lot of housing developments that are owned by exempts. I mean, there's plenty, but a lot of the housing subsidy vouchers land at for-profit taxable institutions.
No, we have the SRA, the Wayfinders, the Springfield Housing Authority. Those are non-tax exempt.
Housing authority is exempt by law. We did have a pilot with them, which ended when they had some fiscal troubles a long time ago. They stopped paying that. And Wayfinders pays on housing, on apartment complexes where they have tenants. That happens. They don't pay on their last I knew, they weren't paying on their new headquarters on Main Street. But there are buildings in the city that they own, or a subsidiary of them owns it, and they were paying on those. You could check with the assessors, but that's my recollection.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're gonna have to
The
really,
SRA doesn't really own any housing units that I can recall. I mean, they weren't in the business of housing people. They were in the business of trying to move real estate from one owner to another. So a lot of those buildings that you may think of as exempt, they're or having a lot of housing subsidies. There's plenty of for-profit owners who are paying full taxes on those. Yeah, trying to think of what other better homes. Maybe you're thinking like the new housing on Central Street, new construction on Central Street.
no, there's the Springfield Housing Authority has,
Well, they've got over 2,000 units, but they're exempt by 121B. That's a function of state law. They're exempt under Chapter 121B.
but they take federal funding. I guess that's the part that I really wanted some clarity on, and I was hoping that the solicitor was able to like fill in some of that. Steve,
Yeah,
do
there
you
was
have?
a time when the housing authority paid significant money. It was over 200 grand, may have been over 300 grand at one time, but
Yeah,
that time has passed.
right. Before we, yeah, just give me a quick second. I see an array of hands went up. Steve, would you be able to comment on Ken's question briefly? Then after that, we're going to follow with Latoria and Walsh.
Well, I
Excuse me.
get back to my original question to Mr. Cirillo, is that this all is voluntary. There's no federal or state or municipal, federal or state law that requires a pilot agreement with a municipality. This has to be a voluntary agreement, or at least you got to bring them to the table.
Yep.
I think what's happened in the past is that if the city has leverage on an entity that's trying to either move into the city, expand in the city, or do something with the city, and they need cooperation by the city, oftentimes then the city would engage. And then you throw on top of that, when times are tough, that's when the city is pushed for it. So, my experience was with Bay State Medical Center. When the city was in serious, dire financial stress in the 2000s and the late 2000s, we put some pressure on Bay State Medical Center because at that time their sheet was pretty healthy at the time, and so there became a bit of a call, and then the only people that really stepped up at that time was Bay State Medical, but it was the legislative delegation that was putting pressure on Bay State to say yes, along with the city, and then they ended up doing that, but that's where I can understand having a blank, a policy. I follow all that, and I wholeheartedly agree with that, to try to be fair and consistent, to hopefully encourage others to join. I guess our struggle continues to be, you have major institutions that are all claiming financial struggles at the moment. How do we get them to the table? I know you're doing it in Holyoke, and I've talked to the mayor in Holyoke and his solicitor, and they're going to try to cajole and try to browbeat, I don't want to be that unfair, but they are going to try to apply pressure on those nonprofits. I just don't know how we do it in the city of Springfield is the real question.
Oh, I'm sure we can be quite creative, solicitor. All right. All right, I want to move on to Juan and then followed by Katie Walsh.
Thank you, Counselor. Just some brief comments here. I want to thank the Collins Center for being here today. It's a weighty topic and it's too much for one meeting, but I'm confident that we want to continue the conversations because ultimately, while the purpose of this meeting was to allow the Collins Center to introduce themselves to this committee, we are very interested in seeking the Collins Center's support through a formal contract that would allow us to work with them on a more regularly and structured basis to help us put together, a pilot policy in the city of Springfield. If I could sum up everything that's been said today over the last 20 to 30 years about pilots in Springfield, it's simply that the interest in pilots ebbs and flows. And it depends on, like the solicitor has mentioned, whether or not there's a transaction taking place and there's an opportunity. It depends on maybe what Mr. Allen says in the case of the Mental Health Association, where sometimes you just have a great city partner that's very interested in being proactive in doing this. Sometimes it depends on, timing or having the right people in the room, whether it be the state delegation putting pressure on Bay State or a time in the history of the city of Springfield where our financial, concerns are more prominent and discussed in the public sphere. So the goal has to be, and Carrie and I have created a rough document, but we certainly need to help with it, is to create a permanent pilot committee along with a permanent pilot policy that allows, years after this particular city council subcommittee may not be discussing pilots anymore, people in the city to respond week to week, day to day, month to month, year to year, to different things that are going on that should all have us raise our ears to discuss pilots. And so that, in my mind, is the goal. And so with the time I have, I'm just looking to understand from Sarah and from Steve, without necessarily going into the specific details of your relationship with Holyoke, what did you need from Holyoke in order to come up with a proposal? Because as Sarah was so helpful to share with me, we are planning on seeking funding in the form of a grant from the Department of Local Services. They have a community grant that's focused on city best practices, and they've confirmed that seeking pilot agreements would be a financial best practice. So what might you need from us to consider a proposal?
Great question, Ajay. Sarah or Steve?
I can take that. So the Collins Center, because we are located at UMass Boston and are therefore part of a state agency, the Collins Center can enter into agreements with other governmental entities around the Commonwealth without having to go through a procurement that complies with 30B. And so when the Collins Center is out talking with potential clients about their needs, really, we can, the two parties can negotiate a scope of work that is appropriate for them, and sign what's called an intergovernmental service agreement. And so that's sort of the process. The way it usually works with the Collins Center is that we want to hear from our potential clients what help they need from us. Sometimes it is very clear what they want. They want some deliverable. They want a draft pilot policy. Other times it might be more of a strategy support. So we want 20 hours of Steve Cirillo's time to participate in strategy sessions around pilot negotiations. So all of these different things can be compiled into a scope of work that's most appropriate and most reflective of the city's needs. So we can go through that process however it makes sense for you all. But negotiating that back and forth is the process we would have to go through. The Community Compact Best Practices Grant Program, and I'll add the caveat that assuming that it is re-upped by the state legislature in their upcoming budget for FY26, will most likely, based on what's happened in the past, open in mid-August. And so what we have tended to do with our cities and towns who intend to use that grant program is to prepare the scope of work well before that time. Whether that means, now or over the summer. But we like to get those proposals into your hands so that when the grant opens, you are ready to go with the language. And that's really important for this grant because it's not a competitive grant, as I was speaking to you about. It's actually a first come, first serve grant. So it's really important that we hit the right deadline so that you guys can get that money and then be ready to go. So those are sort of the logistics.
Jay, I think you said the deadline is September, correct?
There's not so much a deadline, Mr. Chairman, as Sarah alluded to. After the state passes the fiscal year budget, as part of that, there will hopefully be a line item for this grant. And then at a date to be determined, the mayor is going to get an email along with all the other heads of municipalities across the state that says this grant is open. And the municipalities that fill out the grant and submit it first are going to be the ones most likely to receive the funding. And the only thing that we have in our favor at the very beginning is that they don't award a grant to the same municipality 2 years in a row. If you get it in 1 year, you're not going to get it the next year. Which is why I've been meeting with Sequoia Malone from the CAFO's budget. We've already looked and received a template of what the grant looks like. It's a very simple form. As Sarah's alluded to, the scope of work is the one piece of it where you need to provide some additional details. And what she's alluded to is precisely what we want. We want, I'll put a date out there, by July 1st, to know all of the partner organizations that we want to work with, the amount of money they would require for our negotiated agreement, and basically a completed scope of work, so that in the case of Mr. Malone, he's got all that information in a document. Let's make up a date. On August 12th, the mayor gets an email. He sends it to CAFO Bono. She sends it to Mr. Malone. He provides the information, and, for a lack of better words, the mayor presses the button the same day, and we're right up front in the queue. That gives us the best chance to receive the funding. And I think when I remember speaking to the agency, they said that they entertain things up to about $50,000 or so. So we have the room, Mr. Chairman, to work with a number of different organizations that we think might make sense to help us in this process.
Correct. Thank you, Jay. I
Hey,
want to do a quick
Can I
time
ask
check.
Jay a question
Sure.
regarding the
Give me a quick
price?
second, Sarah. Just a quick time check. It's 2:51. I want to be cognizant of people's time. It's been an hour. Time flies when you're having fun. This is a great meeting, very, very informative meeting. So what I'm going to do, I know Councilor Walsh had her hand up in a while. So I do believe, Sarah, you had a response to Jay?
Quickly,
You do. So what we're going to do is this. So Sarah, you respond. Then after that, it's going to be Councilor Walsh and then Karen.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly say that the Collins Center is available sort of on a pro bono basis to help cities and towns figure out how to maximize the use of that grant. So there are little like things that we know that your team may or may not know, but we just always want to pass them along. So please definitely feel that it would be appropriate to reach out to me and ask, how can we maximize this grant? We could talk about the budgets. We can talk about the fact that there are opportunities for 2 different grants. So if you have another project that would be helpful for the city,
Right.
I would really encourage you to pursue both. And so on. So I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Sarah. Councilor Walsh, followed by Karen.
Uh,
Karen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for our Steve Bonacani. Steve, I'm wondering, listening to this conversation about the need for a pilot policy, is that something that the full council would have to address and vote on before you can make applications for grants or move on?
I'm sorry, Councilor Walsh, would you mind repeating your question, please?
Yeah, I wanted to know what the role of the full city council is regarding a pilot policy. And is that
Okay.
something that needs a vote?
Thank you, Councilor Walsh. Steve? You're muted, Steve.
Yes, Counselor, I think that if you wanted to put it into either an order or an ordinance, if we put it into an ordinance form, then obviously it would require a city council vote. So my understanding is that the process would be to try to apply for the grant right after the passage of the state budget when the grant is open. Try to engage the services of the Collins Center, who would then come in with their scope of services and probably assist us as much as we wanted, at least in the ordinance or the like, and templates about and how to establish who the targets would be. But that would ultimately have to be supported by the mayor and then put to the city council for a vote, become the policy of the city. Or at least that, if I'm hearing correctly, the idea is to formalize this as much as you can and to make it a very consistent process across the board. So
That's correct. Yep.
So the council would be engaged.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Thank you.
Anything else, Councilor Walsh?
No, that's all I needed to know.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, just to get back to Jay.
Mhm.
I think I lost you there. Okay, just to get back to, so for example, we put in a request for $50,000. And between the Collins Center and the Loam Center, we don't use all that money. There's leftover funds. And maybe the CAFO can address this, because we at one point were looking at having a budget of some kind that we could tap into for, a small expenditure. So I'm just wondering, like, if we had 50,000 and there's extra money in there, is that something that the pilot committee, if they find they need a different subcontractor for something, would that money be available to us? I don't know, maybe Lindsay can answer that question. I don't know.
The best answer I can give based on what I understand so far is the Department of Local Services through their Community Compact, grant is only going to provide a precise dollar amount if based on what we negotiate. So hypothetical, if the Collins Center says this scope of work is $25,000 and we get the grant for $25,000 and then Sarah comes back 6 months later and says, oh, we only needed to charge you $20,000. I presume we got to give the $5,000 back to the state. So I would say that separately, I would defer to the members of government as to, smaller expenditures that this committee might need to, achieve its goals on a one-by-one basis, is my thought.
Thank you. Lindsay, did you want to follow up on that? If you don't, it's okay.
as far as a budget in the general fund?
Karen, was that the use of your question?
So if we do receive this grant from the state and we ask for 50,000, but we don't end up using it all, could those funds also be used for, another subcontractor, something for the pilot committee that we didn't anticipate?
That
Or
would
would
be a decision of the granting agency.
Okay,
So there's been times that we have been able to make budget amendments for a specific
Hmm.
grant. But there's been times we haven't, so that would be a decision of the state.
oh, good point, thank you.
So Jerry sounds to me that that's a good question to ask as well, right? I'm assuming that as long as the use is as similar or as related as possible to the original intent, should be
Sure.
okay. That's my educated guess.
Yeah, I agree. I can ask that question, but I do see, Mr. Chairman, that Sarah's hand is up. She may
Yeah, I
have
saw her. Yep,
even
yep.
more feedback for us.
Sure, sure. Sarah, floor is yours.
Thank you. So the state has historically, and by the state, I mean Division of Local Services, the grantee, the grantor, has been somewhat flexible in terms of reallocating budget to a new but related component of a scope of work. However, I would encourage you to spend the time and be thoughtful about what you need. You do not have to say, okay, well, we're doing a grant and we can only hire one provider, one vendor, and that means we're going to go with the Collins Center. You can build a budget for your grant that includes multiple vendors should you need them. So let me give you an example that's focused on pilot. We need, hypothetically, the city needs somebody with a deep understanding of assessing to come in and look at the assessor's data and process and figure out whether the data quality right now supports the implementation of the pilot program. That's going to be one vendor. It's going to be $15,000 for that vendor. Collins Center is going to come in and help us develop a policy and help us develop strategies for negotiation. That's $15,000. So that's $30,000 total. Then we're going to have to pay special counsel, or we might need some other legal advice on this to supplement what we have in-house. Maybe that's another $15,000, and that gets you to the budget of $45,000 for the grant. But your subcommittee also wants to hold 2 public meetings, and you want to rent a space, and you want to provide food, and you want to do whatever else, and that the budget for those events is going to be $1,500. So then you would add all that up and submit it as part of the grant application. That's the best way to approach it. And we can help you think through how to maximize to make sure that you're just covering all of what you might need. That's the best way to get all of the budget that you need for what you want to do in the ensuing 2 years. The grant cycle is a 2-year cycle, and you can expend the funds anywhere within that 2-year cycle. And sometimes projects do take 18 months, because it's an iterative process. So.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yes.
So the time is now 3 o'clock. We've been at this for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm sure we can go another hour and 15 minutes of this, but I want to be cognizant of people's time. I want to start wrapping up. Does anybody have any closing question or thoughts? Karen?
Yes. Richard, I would love to be able to talk with you offline. Is there an email or something, or could I get your phone number from your brother, maybe? Would it be all right? I have his number.
You're muted, Richie.
You're muted.
Richie, you're muted.
Muted. Can't hear you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
Just
great.
text my brother and he'll give you the number, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I do have one last thing.
Sure, go ahead.
If the assessor or the comptroller / treasurer or the capo is in the room, I don't know
I
if they are.
think they all
can't-
left. The only one left is the Acting Controller, Steve, are you hiding there? I see your head there. There you go.
Okay.
Can you move over like there you go.
There we go. Now there's someone in the room.
There we go.
Okay.
How you
All right.
been?
So I don't know, this might sound petty, but every year the city closes streets for a weekend or a week for certain events. But the Student Prince has a special permit to stay open, close off the public street for like 7 months, and the public doesn't have access to it. So my question is, are they being charged a square footage for that restaurant space that they're using that's in the public way? And if they're not, how do we make that happen, or who would be the person to?
I can honestly say that's not me, in that the tax collector, we print the bills and send them out, as former assessor Allen will tell you. And the assessors would be the ones that would tell you what the calculation to the bill was.
Sure.
Okay.
Gail, you have a response? Excuse me, Steve.
Yeah,
Cirillo?
I would just say that the city would have to issue a permit for that
Yeah.
street to be shut off, and that permit would have a fee attached to it.
Yeah, no, they have a special permit for 7 months to close down the street so they can have outside dining there. And they received an ARPA grant to pay for new tables and chairs for this outdoor dining, but they're not paying square footage on that extra space that they're earning a profit on. So I
Oh,
think
it
that
should-
they
I
should be
I
charged.
can certainly check and see what's going on. I don't have firsthand knowledge right now of it, but I can certainly find out.
Who issued the special permit?
The city council.
City Council. Yeah, City Council. This is
Next
about
year.
3 years ago.
Next year, put a fee attached to it.
Any
I'd
other question?
appreciate that. Thank you, Steve.
Any other question?
Just to say,
No.
Counselor, in closing, we may continue to do research and may not learn all the history about why every existing pilot agreement was created and why legacy pilot agreements that were created were eventually, eliminated. But I think we're getting closer to what we want to do, which is, as Mr. Cirillo alluded to, is to have a plan and a team to evaluate every parcel that exists today and determine a strategy for how to negotiate a pilot agreement or to renegotiate a pilot agreement. So I felt this meeting was really useful, and I thank all of you, and especially Steve and Sarah.
Yes, thank
Very
you.
informative.
I definitely agree. So I want to thank everybody. The time is now 3:05. Steve Cirillo, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. We are going to go back to the drawing board here, and we will be in contact with you. I think you guys have been in touch with mainly Karen, correct? Is that correct, Karen?
Jay is,
Jay, okay.
I'm working with the Loam Institute.
Loan Institute,
Jay
Jay
was
Jay
working
Collins.
with the Collins. Yeah.
So Jay is going to be your contact guy. And so I thank you so much for this information. This was a very thorough conversation, and you guys have a wealth of knowledge and institutional knowledge to make this happen. And like Jay said a little while ago, the main goal is not only to increase revenue, but also to ensure that we create policies and a standing committee so that moving forward, 100 years from now, that this is still alive, healthy, and that the city is getting the appropriate revenue that it deserves so that we can continue our mission of providing services and a good quality of life to our residents. As I mentioned before, nonprofits are our partners, and we really need them to step up at the plate because their success, our success, and our success is their success as well. So with that, I thank you so much. The time is now 3:06, and the meeting of the general government, the Pilot Revenue Committee is adjourned. Thank you, everybody. God bless.